Hi, my name is Sean, and this is my video for AHA Awareness Day. I'll start with two facts about me. First, I've been running since I was 6 years old. I've run everything from a 1 miler to a full marathon, and I'm a healthcare worker specializing in oncology and hematology. When I was diagnosed after 20 years of practice, I had never heard of this disease. It was May 2019. I was 44 years old, having just completed a half marathon a few months before, taking third in my age group. Excellent health, didn't take any prescription medications, and just visited my doctor once a year. But it was Monday, and I had gone to work as normal. I was going to go for a short run around the university campus I work on. And halfway through the run, only 4 miles, I had to stop and catch my breath, which was really unusual for me. I chalked it up to just being tired after a busy weekend. So went about my business, went home, went to work the rest of the week, not feeling exactly great, but felt a little bit better on Thursday. I had planned to go for a run and then meet friends for dinner afterwards. And I went out for my run, just a usual 6 miles. And I got to 3/10 of a mile, and my heart was racing so fast I had to stop. I wore a running watch, and my pulse was well over 180 beats a minute, which was extremely unusual. And I was having pain running up and down my legs. Um, Tried walking a little bit and getting back into a running stride, and I just couldn't do it. So, being a mental health therapist, I felt that this was probably something psychological related. I'd had a busy few years before with job changes and buying a house and losing my dad. So I thought maybe this is my body telling me you really need to take a break. You've been pushing yourself too hard. So cleaned up and went out to dinner with my friends. I also noticed that night that as a wine drinker, the red wine did not taste good to me, which was very curious. So over the next month, I developed all of these different symptoms that I was not familiar with, and it was not me. Extreme fatigue, shortness of breath. I noticed that my resting pulse went from high 40s, low 50s to the mid 70s and even into the 80s. And I decided I needed to see my doctor. Made an appointment, went. Fortunately, I had to see the physician assistant. And being a healthcare worker and a runner, I know my body pretty well. And I went in and I said, I think I've got anemia. And I'll never forget the words of that physician assistant. She goes, I don't think you have anemia. I think you have a heart condition. Well, I immediately knew I did not have a heart condition. But I asked her to please run a series of blood tests to rule out the anemia. She agreed to order those, and she also ordered an EKG on a treadmill. So I scheduled my treadmill. That did not go very well. I started the test, and very quickly my heart rate escalated to over 200 beats a minute. So they stopped the test early. While the technician couldn't tell me that he didn't think I had a heart problem, he suggested it. He was going to have one of my friends who was a cardiologist read it and get back to me as soon as he could. And my blood test came back. What a normal hemoglobin for a man my age would have been 14 to 16, mine was 8. The nurse practitioner or physician assistant called me back and said, you need to go to the emergency room. While being a healthcare worker and a little stubborn, I'm like, I don't feel that bad. I don't think I need to go to the emergency room. So I waited another week. So this is now a month since my symptoms first started. And once again, it was on a Monday. I had an important meeting at work that I could not miss. So I went to work, and I was shivering, short of breath, absolutely fatigued, having a hard time concentrating, and sat through work until 4 o'clock, until the meetings were over. I was getting ready to leave when my staff noticed that I fell against the wall. I'd gotten so weak I could barely walk. And they demanded that I go to the emergency room. They wanted to drive me, but once again, being a stubborn man, I looked online for the hospital that was in network that had private rooms. So I went home. Wrongly, I wouldn't have done this again. I went home, took a shower, I packed a bag, and drove myself to the emergency room. As I walked in, I was too weak to make it all the way to the check-in counter, and they had to get a wheelchair to bring me in. Apparently, I looked so bad that they took me right back. I've never seen a series of tests run so quickly. CT scan, ultrasound, X-ray, and blood work. My temperature was 103.5 and my hemoglobin came back at 5. So they started an emergency blood transfusion. So I ended up spending the night in the emergency room. Not where I had planned to do, hoping that I would have gotten released with some simple answer. The hospitalist was clueless on what it could be. She ordered consults with GI, infectious disease, and hematology. The GI surgeon came in, asked me a few questions, and said, "I don't think you've got a GI bleed. You would notice it by now." The infectious disease doctor thought I might have a tick-borne illness called babesiosis, something else I'd never heard of before because I had traveled to both Cape Cod and Montana where the disease was prevalent within the last year. And then finally the hematologist came in. She said, "I think I know what you've got, but I've got to run this test. It's called a Coombs test, and unfortunately, it's going to take 3 days to come back. If it comes back, we'll know exactly what to do." So finally got her room the next day, and I spent the next 9 days in that room. My Coombs test came back positive for warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia, and I was started on high-dose IV steroids. Unfortunately, that did absolutely nothing for me. I required daily blood transfusions. I was running a mild fever the entire time, had to stay on Tylenol. And what began to be very bizarre was that about 7 p.m. every night, my temperature would spike to 102 and my hemoglobin would start falling again, necessitating that I had a blood transfusion overnight. Finally, once I'd failed the steroids, my doctor changed the regimen and moved me to rituximab, which brand name is Rituxan. And what's really interesting about that drug is that early in my career, I was working at one of the hospitals where it was undergoing clinical trials. So I feel like some of the early work and research I supported ended up saving my life. So I was moved to the ICU, and my infusion was started that night. Unfortunately, I had some severe event, not related to the Rituxan itself, but it was my disease was just escalating. And my LDH, which is a measure of how much damage you have in your bloodstream, which should generally be less than 181, I spiked to 28,000, the highest they had ever seen. My temperature went up to 105 and my hemoglobin dropped again to 5. So they had to stop the infusion, start an emergency blood transfusion, and put me on a cooling mat, which was not fun. Did not sleep very well that night at all. And finally, the next morning, my doctor came back in, and we restarted the infusion at a much slower rate. And I finished it finally late on a Wednesday afternoon. She said, "It'll take a couple days before we know if this is going to work." So Thursday, I was absolutely exhausted, but I sat there patiently, them taking my blood work every 6 hours, hoping to begin to see it climb. And unfortunately, it stayed right at 7 all day on Thursday. They came in on Friday at 6 a.m. to take my normal blood work, and I had the app on my phone so I could see when it resulted and could check my own numbers. So my 6 a.m. blood draw came back at 8. The doctor came in that morning, and she said, "I'll feel safe letting you go when you get to 10, but would you be willing to stay one more day?" I said, "I'll stay one more day if that's what you recommend." And so they came in to do my 12 o'clock blood work, and they drew it, and at 1 o'clock that afternoon, it came back at 10. And I looked at my mom and I said, "Help me pack, we are getting out of here." I had now been in the hospital for over 11 days, hadn't been home, hadn't been able to have a real shower. And I'll never forget driving out of the parking lot of the hotel or of the hospital, having to stop for gas and finally walking into my house. I dropped my bag, looked at my mom and said, "I'm now going to go take an hour shower." But for me, I thought about what was the message that I wanted you all to hear. One, I have an unusual presentation where It came on very strong. And I've been very fortunate. I responded very well to the Rituxan. I had my first infusion on that Wednesday, was released on Friday, and was then scheduled for outpatient Rituxan the following Wednesday, a week later. I had the Rituxan on Wednesday, felt well enough. I went back to work on Thursday. Saturday, I went to the gym, and on Sunday, I went for my first run, very slowly, in over a month and a half. So that I know a lot of people struggle to get into remission, and they deal with this disease uh, for years. First, not even knowing what it is and seeking a diagnosis, but also struggling with trying to get to feel better. So I recognize and I am so grateful of the treatment that I had and that it worked. But what I want to leave with you all is that when I was diagnosed, there was no AHA Awareness Day. There was no wAIHA Warriors. There was the American Rare Disease Association that I got a little information on, but I struggled to make a connection with anyone with this disease who could understand what it's like to have something nobody else has and is so bizarre in its presentation. Being a social worker by trade, I love connection, I love advocating, and so I started looking at ways I could give back. And fortunately, I found an organization that connected me with a um, with a pharmaceutical company who was doing research on wAIHA and wanted to develop a patient support program. And I, with Karen, were two of the first people that began talking about this and brought it to fruition so that people out there with our disease have someone they can talk to. They have a website they can go to and get real information, make a connection, and get the support I didn't have when I was alone in that hospital room. So that's my story. I hope you found it interesting and hope you will continue to support research for all of the different AHA diagnoses.